Open every tornado shelter. Now. And if anyone delays that order, they'll answer to me. The conference room fell silent so abruptly that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear. At 8:12 on a bright spring morning, sunlight poured through the glass walls of Brooks Meridian Logistics, one of the largest distribution hubs in central Oklahoma. Forklifts moved with clockwork precision across the loading yards below, freight trucks rolled through security gates, and more than 400 employees had already settled into what promised to be another profitable day. Nothing about the sky hinted at danger. It was clear. Blue. Almost peaceful. Malcolm Brooks stood at the head of the operations table, dressed in dark jeans, worn work boots, and a charcoal jacket that looked more suited for walking the warehouse floor than leading a billion-dollar corporation. At 47, the black CEO carried himself with quiet confidence rather than spectacle. He rarely raised his voice, rarely repeated himself, and never issued orders without purpose. This morning, however, every face around the table wore the same expression. Confusion. Ethan Walker leaned back in his chair, letting out a sharp laugh that bounced off the polished walls. "You're opening every shelter because of what?" he asked, folding his arms. The weather app says sunshine all afternoon. A few department managers exchanged uneasy smiles. Someone chuckled under their breath. Another quietly shook his head. Malcolm didn't acknowledge the laughter. His eyes remained fixed on the enormous weather display covering one side of the room. Layers of satellite imagery drifted across the screen while dozens of tiny data points updated every few seconds. He spoke without turning around. "Execute the emergency protocol." No explanation. No dramatic speech. Just 4 words. Ethan pushed his chair back with enough force for the wheels to scrape across the floor. "This is exactly how companies lose money," he said loudly. "You shut down loading docks, stop production, scare employees, and for what? Blue skies?" Several supervisors nodded. One whispered, "He's overreacting." Another added, "This'll become a joke by lunchtime." Across the room, a young systems technician named Emily Carter hesitated as her fingers hovered above her keyboard. She glanced between Malcolm and the live atmospheric feed streaming across her monitors. Something felt unusual. A pressure graph had dipped slightly within the last 20 minutes, but not enough to trigger any official warning. Not yet. She swallowed the thought and stayed quiet. Malcolm finally turned. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. "I didn't ask for opinions," he said evenly. "I gave an order." The words landed heavier than anyone expected. Still, Ethan refused to let it go. He stepped toward the center of the room, his expensive suit standing in sharp contrast to Malcolm's practical clothes. "You know what this looks like?" Ethan asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It looks like panic. Maybe the board likes expensive mistakes, but I don't." Several employees lowered their eyes. Others watched Malcolm carefully, waiting for the argument everyone assumed would follow. It never came. Instead, Malcolm picked up a handheld radio. "Security, unlock every tornado shelter. Maintenance, inspect every emergency generator. Medical teams move to standby positions. Complete confirmation within 6 minutes." The radio crackled with hesitant acknowledgments. Not because the teams doubted him. Because no one else understood why. Outside the glass windows, a light breeze stirred the American flags near the entrance. Delivery drivers continued unloading trailers. Workers laughed as they crossed the parking lot carrying coffee cups, completely unaware that somewhere beyond the distant horizon, something invisible had already begun moving toward them. Inside the operations room, Ethan folded his arms with a smug smile. "This will be remembered," he muttered. Malcolm looked toward the western skyline for one long second. "Yes," he answered quietly. "It will." For several long seconds, no one moved. The hesitation spread through the operations center faster than any spoken argument. Supervisors exchanged uncertain glances. Tablets remained untouched. Radios stayed clipped to belts. Outside the glass walls, trailers continued lining up at the loading docks as though the morning were unfolding exactly as planned. Only Malcolm Brooks seemed untouched by the uncertainty. He walked toward the western windows overlooking nearly 200 acres of warehouses, rail connections, and distribution yards. His hands rested loosely in the pockets of his jacket, his attention fixed somewhere beyond the visible horizon. Emily Carter couldn't stop watching him. She had worked in the company's weather analytics division for only 14 months, but she had already noticed something unusual about the CEO. Malcolm never interrupted experts. He never overruled data simply because he outranked someone. If he gave an instruction that seemed impossible to understand, experience had taught employees there was usually information they hadn't seen yet. Still, today's order felt different. She enlarged another atmospheric map. Surface temperatures looked ordinary. Humidity remained moderate. The regional warning center had issued nothing beyond a routine forecast. Then one number caught her attention. Pressure. It had fallen again. Barely. So little that most automated systems would ignore it. Emily frowned, refreshing the feed twice before quietly opening a second database that few departments ever bothered to monitor. The numbers didn't confirm danger, but they refused to reassure her either. Across the room, Ethan Walker had no interest in weather models. He was already speaking with the logistics managers clustered around the conference table. If we follow this, he said confidently, we'll delay over 70 outbound shipments before noon. One manager nodded. Customers won't care if it was a false alarm. They'll care that their deliveries are late. Another crossed his arms. We've spent years building our reputation. One unnecessary shutdown damages all of it. The conversation gathered momentum. Every sentence made Malcolm's decision appear less reasonable. More expensive. More embarrassing. One supervisor finally raised his voice toward the CEO. Sir, shouldn't we at least wait for the National Weather Service before triggering emergency operations? Malcolm turned slowly. No. Nothing more. The answer hung in the room with unsettling finality. Some interpreted it as arrogance. Others mistook it for stubbornness. Emily saw something else. Conviction. Not the confidence of someone hoping to be right. The certainty of someone who had already accepted the consequences of acting before everyone else. Malcolm's phone vibrated once. He glanced at the screen, reading a brief message from the company's private meteorological consultant. Wind shear increasing faster than expected. Monitoring. He locked the screen without showing anyone. Outside, the breeze shifted almost imperceptibly. Flags that had fluttered lazily only minutes earlier now stretched toward the east before falling still again. Warehouse workers continued laughing during their morning break. A maintenance crew rolled tool carts across the concrete. Nothing looked dangerous. That was precisely what troubled Malcolm. Years earlier, he had learned that the most violent storms often borrowed their first disguise from perfect mornings. Behind him, Ethan smiled with growing confidence as more department heads drifted to his side instead of the CEO's. He lowered his voice just enough for those nearby to hear. When this is over, he muttered, the board will finally realize leadership isn't about instincts. It's about facts. Malcolm never looked back. His eyes remained fixed on the western skyline, where a single dark cloud had quietly appeared, small enough for almost everyone to dismiss, but impossible for him to ignore. The room that had once moved with quiet precision was beginning to fracture. Radios finally crackled to life, but the responses came unevenly. Warehouse 3 acknowledges. Maintenance is standing by. A pause. Then another voice. Operations B is waiting for supervisor approval. Malcolm's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Someone wasn't following orders. Across the conference room, Ethan Walker wasn't hiding it anymore. He stood beside the digital logistics board, speaking with enough confidence that employees naturally drifted toward him. Listen carefully, he said. There is no official tornado warning. No emergency bulletin. No evacuation order from the county. Several supervisors nodded immediately. We don't shut down a billion-dollar operation because someone has a feeling. A few uneasy laughs spread through the group. The atmosphere shifted. It was no longer simple confusion. It had become open resistance. Emily Carter watched the exchange while refreshing another atmospheric feed. The pressure continued to fall. Still no official alert. Her heartbeat quickened. Something wasn't adding up. Meanwhile, the warehouse floor below continued operating at full speed. Forklifts crossed busy intersections. Conveyor belts carried thousands of packages toward outbound trailers. Drivers signed paperwork without ever glancing at the sky. Everything looked ordinary. Almost unnaturally ordinary. Ethan picked up his own radio. "Dock supervisors," he announced, "continue normal operations until further notice. Do not suspend loading unless authorized through standard emergency channels." Several confirmations answered almost immediately. "Copy that." "Understood. We'll stay operational." Emily looked up sharply. Her eyes darted toward Malcolm. He had heard every word. For several seconds he said nothing. The silence felt heavier than shouting. Finally, he walked toward Ethan. Neither man raised his voice. "You countermanded my order. I corrected it. You delayed emergency preparation. I protected this company from unnecessary panic." The room seemed to shrink around them. No one dared interrupt. Ethan folded his arms. "You expect people to trust invisible danger over visible facts." Malcolm met his gaze without blinking. "Leadership isn't tested when everyone agrees." Ethan smiled. "It isn't leadership if nobody follows." For the first time that morning, Malcolm stepped closer. Not aggressively. Deliberately. "If one employee dies because someone wanted another 20 minutes of productivity," he said quietly, "those numbers on your logistics board won't matter anymore." The word settled into the room like stone. Even Ethan hesitated. Only for a moment. Then he scoffed. "We're talking about imaginary casualties." Emily suddenly noticed another anomaly. The wind sensors along the western perimeter had all shifted direction within less than 90 seconds. That shouldn't happen. She enlarged the graph. A second monitor flashed. Then another. Wind velocity increasing. Rapidly. Her pulse accelerated. She quickly overlaid 3 separate datasets. Pressure. Temperature. Wind shear. Individually, none of them justified panic. Together. Her face slowly lost its color. Across the room, someone near the windows frowned. "Is it getting darker?" Several heads turned. The sunlight had softened without anyone noticing. Not dramatically. Just enough that the bright warehouse roofs no longer reflected the same sharp glare. Outside, workers instinctively looked toward the western horizon. The single cloud Malcolm had watched only minutes earlier was no longer alone. Behind it stretched a widening wall of charcoal gray sky, rolling silently across the plains with unsettling speed. No thunder. No rain. Only an unnatural stillness that settled over the distribution yard like the world itself had paused to take one final breath. Emily Carter's chair scraped sharply across the floor. "I need everyone to look at this." The urgency in her voice cut through the room more effectively than any alarm. Dozens of eyes turned toward the weather station projected across her monitors. The colorful charts meant little to most of the managers, but Emily wasn't looking at the graphics anymore. She was looking at what had disappeared. "The surface wind sensors just went quiet," she said, barely taking a breath. "Not offline, quiet." Ethan frowned. "What difference does that make?" Emily zoomed into another display. When multiple sensor arrays suddenly flatten like this, it usually means the atmosphere is reorganizing. Several supervisors exchanged puzzled looks. She continued, pointing to another graph. "The pressure isn't just falling anymore. It's accelerating." Still, the room remained unconvinced. One operations manager shrugged. So we get a thunderstorm? Emily shook her head. No. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, overlaying another stream of live radar data received from a private weather network used by the company to protect high-value shipments. A faint rotation appeared. Weak. Almost invisible. But unmistakable. Her heartbeat quickened. I've never seen it develop this fast. The room grew quieter. Malcolm walked toward her workstation without saying a word. He studied the screen for only a few seconds before giving a small nod. Thank you. It was the first confirmation Emily needed. Ethan folded his arms again, refusing to yield. A tiny rotation 50 miles away, he scoffed. You're shutting down an entire operation over that. Before Emily could answer, one of the dispatch coordinators near the window spoke nervously. The birds. Everyone instinctively looked outside. Hundreds of birds were lifting from the trees surrounding the property. Not drifting. Exploding into the sky all at once. Within seconds they disappeared toward the southeast. An uncomfortable silence settled over the operations center. One warehouse supervisor muttered, almost to himself, "That's strange." Malcolm's eyes never left the horizon. "No," he said quietly. "It's familiar." For just an instant, the room around him disappeared. He was 12 years old again. A dirt road. A farmhouse. His father's truck parked beside a weathered barn. The same unnatural stillness. The same birds abandoning the fields. The same heavy air that seemed impossible to breathe. He remembered asking why everything had become so quiet. His father had looked west and answered with words Malcolm never forgot. When nature stops making noise, son, it's because something louder is coming. The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Malcolm pressed the button on his radio. Emergency Protocol Alpha. This time his voice carried through every speaker in the facility. Immediate shelter movement. Every employee. No exceptions. Across the room, Ethan stepped forward. You can't do this. I already have. You don't have enough evidence. Malcolm turned to face him. I have enough responsibility. Before Ethan could answer, every phone inside the operations center vibrated simultaneously. A county emergency notification flashed across dozens of screens. Tornado watch upgraded. Conditions rapidly deteriorating. Remain alert for immediate warnings. No one spoke. The notification wasn't a tornado warning. But it was the first official acknowledgement that Malcolm had not imagined the danger. Emily stared at her monitor. The small rotating signature had doubled in size. Outside, the western sky darkened with startling speed, swallowing the morning sunlight section by section until long shadows stretched across the loading yards. Far below, workers who had laughed only minutes earlier stopped where they stood, instinctively looking upward. Then, somewhere in the distance, a low rumble rolled across the plains. It wasn't thunder. It sounded deeper. Slower. Like the earth itself had begun to breathe. The low rumble grew louder. Not in a sudden crash, but in a slow, relentless swell that seemed to rise from beneath the concrete itself. Coffee cups on the conference table trembled almost imperceptibly. Ceiling lights flickered once before settling back into a steady glow. Every conversation stopped. Emily Carter stared at the radar display, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. It's strengthening, she whispered. The rotating signature that had seemed insignificant only moments ago was expanding with frightening speed. Bright shades of red and purple began wrapping around its core. Her software chimed. Once. Then again. This time it wasn't the county. It was the company's private forecasting network. Rotational velocity exceeding safe threshold. Before anyone could react, another notification appeared across every monitor in the operations center. Tornado warning. Take shelter immediately. For one endless heartbeat, nobody moved. Ethan Walker looked at the screen as if refusing to understand the words in front of him. No. His voice barely escaped his throat. That's impossible. Outside the glass walls, the transformation was terrifying. The blue morning sky had vanished completely. Massive clouds twisted together above the western horizon, rolling toward the logistics complex with impossible speed. The sunlight disappeared beneath a wall of darkness, throwing the entire facility into an eerie gray twilight. The wind struck without warning. A violent blast slammed against the building, rattling every pane of glass. Employees in the loading yard stopped running forklifts and instinctively looked upward. One trailer rocked on its suspension. Another began drifting sideways across the pavement. Then came the sirens. A long, haunting wail erupted across the county. One after another. Then dozens more joined in until the air itself seemed filled with warning. The sound froze everyone where they stood. Malcolm Brooks was already moving. "Begin evacuation." His voice echoed through every hallway as he grabbed another radio. "Warehouse supervisors, move your teams to the nearest shelter. Leave every vehicle where it is. Nobody goes back for equipment." Acknowledgements flooded the radio almost instantly. "Copy. Moving now. South warehouse evacuating." Fear had replaced doubt. Employees poured from offices and loading docks, abandoning paperwork, forklifts, and half-loaded trailers. Hard hats fell to the pavement. Clipboards were left behind. The routine of an ordinary workday dissolved into controlled urgency. Malcolm stepped into the corridor, directing people toward reinforced shelter entrances with quick, precise gestures. "Stay together. Keep moving. Don't run." He stopped only long enough to help an older warehouse employee whose injured knee slowed every step. "We're not leaving anyone behind," Malcolm said, slipping the man's arm over his shoulder. Behind them, Ethan remained standing inside the operations room. His face had turned pale. His confident speeches had vanished. He stared through the western windows as a dark, rotating column began lowering beneath the cloud base miles away. It was still distant, but unmistakable. Emily followed his gaze, her breathing shallow. That's the funnel." Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time that morning, he understood what Malcolm had seen long before anyone else. Another blast of wind shook the building harder than before. A deafening metallic crash echoed from somewhere outside. One of the massive loading bay doors tore free from its tracks and disappeared into the swirling darkness. Emergency lights automatically switched on, bathing the corridors in flashing amber. Malcolm looked toward the operations room one final time. Ethan was still standing there. Still frozen. Still staring at the storm. Without a second's hesitation, Malcolm turned and ran back toward the man who had spent the entire morning trying to undermine him. The warning sirens had become a constant scream. Every second they echoed across the sprawling logistics campus, the distance between survival and disaster grew smaller. "Ethan!" Malcolm's voice cut through the chaos. The operations director didn't respond. He stood motionless before the towering glass windows, unable to pull his eyes away from the monstrous funnel descending in the distance. It no longer looked like a weather event. It looked alive, its dark column twisting against the earth as sheets of dust and debris spiraled upward beneath it. "It can't be," Ethan whispered. Malcolm reached him in 3 strides. "It is." Without another word, Malcolm grabbed Ethan firmly by the arm. "Move." For the first time all morning, Ethan didn't resist. The confidence that had fueled every argument had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable fear of a man realizing he had mistaken certainty for knowledge. The building groaned. A violent gust slammed into the western facade, making the reinforced glass bow inward before snapping back into place. Ceiling tiles rattled overhead. Somewhere below, the fire alarm joined the emergency sirens. Employees hurried through the corridors toward the underground shelter entrances. Managers counted teams aloud. "Receiving has everyone. Accounting is clear." Maintenance is missing too. Malcolm released Ethan only after pushing him toward the nearest stairwell. Get downstairs. What about you? I'm not finished. Before Ethan could answer, Malcolm was already turning back toward the warehouse level. Emily saw him disappear through the emergency doors. Where is he going? She asked. No one answered. The answer arrived moments later over the company radio. This is Malcolm Brooks. Report anyone still inside. Voices immediately flooded the channel. Forklift operator trapped near Dock 12. Security found one contractor on the roof stairwell. Shipping office still searching for 2 drivers. Malcolm didn't hesitate. I'm going. Outside, the wind had become a wall. Rain had not yet begun, but dirt, insulation, shattered plastic, and loose packaging whipped through the air so violently they looked like swarms of insects. Malcolm lowered his shoulder and forced open the warehouse exit. The blast nearly threw him backward. Inside Dock 12, alarms flashed red across the cavernous loading bay. A yellow forklift sat abandoned at an angle. Nearby, a steel storage rack had collapsed, pinning one of the operators beneath scattered pallets. Help! The cry barely carried above the roar outside. Malcolm sprinted across the concrete. You with me? The man's face was covered in dust. I can't move my leg. Malcolm crouched without hesitation. The fallen beam was heavy enough that it refused to budge on the first attempt. He adjusted his footing. Pushed again. Metal groaned. The beam lifted just enough. Pull. The operator dragged himself free with a cry of pain before collapsing against Malcolm's shoulder. Together they stumbled toward the emergency corridor. Halfway there, the lights failed. Darkness swallowed the warehouse for a terrifying second before backup generators restored dim emergency lighting. The entire building shuddered. A deafening crash echoed from somewhere above as part of the roof peeled away under the force of the wind. Cold air exploded into the warehouse. Dust filled every corner. The operator looked back in horror. My God! Malcolm didn't. Keep moving. They reached the reinforced shelter entrance just as security officers pulled the massive steel door open. Employees rushed inside. The injured operator was taken by medics. Malcolm turned immediately to leave again. A security officer blocked his path. Sir, everyone else is inside. Malcolm looked at the attendant's tablet mounted beside the shelter entrance. One name still flashed red. Emily Carter, location unknown. Without waiting for another word, Malcolm disappeared back into the storm-darkened warehouse as the steel shelter door remained open behind him, waiting for 2 people instead of 1. The warehouse had become a maze of noise. Metal shrieked somewhere overhead. Wind forced its way through the torn section of the roof, carrying insulation, dust, and shattered fragments of plastic through the cavernous loading bay. Every emergency light flickered as if struggling to stay alive. Emily! Malcolm's voice disappeared into the roar. No answer. He moved deeper between towering storage racks, scanning every aisle with deliberate precision. The attendant system had marked Emily's access badge inside the analytics wing, but the last location update had frozen nearly 2 minutes earlier. 2 minutes. During a tornado, that could be the difference between life and death. Another violent impact shook the building. A steel beam groaned somewhere above. Malcolm stopped. There. A faint sound. Not a scream. A cough. He followed it through the dim emergency lighting until he reached the weather analysis office. The automatic security door had buckled inward. Emily was trapped behind it. She pushed against the twisted frame with both hands, her face streaked with dust. It won't move. Malcolm dropped to one knee and examined the damage. A ceiling support had shifted just enough to bend the doorway out of alignment. The entire frame was wedged shut. Step back. Emily obeyed immediately. Malcolm planted both hands against the damaged door and pushed. Nothing. The steel refused to move. Another gust struck the building. The floor vibrated beneath them. A loud cracking sound echoed from above. Emily looked toward the ceiling. "We have to go." "We will." Malcolm repositioned himself. Instead of pushing against the center, he forced his shoulder beneath the warped edge and drove upward with everything he had. The metal screamed. A narrow gap appeared. "Now!" Emily squeezed through sideways, scraping her arm against the twisted frame before stumbling into the hallway. She barely caught her balance. "You came back." Malcolm gave a short nod. "I said nobody gets left behind." For the first time since the storm began, Emily's composure broke. "I should have left sooner." "You stayed because you were trying to help." "I stayed because I wanted proof." Malcolm looked directly at her. "Next time, choose people before proof." She lowered her eyes. "I will." A thunderous explosion interrupted them. Not from the sky. From inside the building. One of the exterior loading walls had collapsed. The blast of air racing through the opening nearly knocked them both off their feet. The tornado had reached the complex. The sound was unlike anything either of them had ever heard. Not simply wind. It was hundreds of noises layered together, twisting steel, breaking concrete, flying debris, screaming air, forming one impossible roar that seemed to swallow every other sound in existence. Malcolm instinctively pulled Emily behind a reinforced support column as shattered glass erupted across the corridor. The windows at the end of the hall exploded inward. A rolling wave of dust filled the air. For several terrifying seconds, visibility disappeared completely. "Stay with me," Malcolm shouted. Emily grabbed the back of his jacket. "I've got you." Bent nearly double against the pressure, they fought their way toward the shelter entrance. Every step felt like walking against an invisible wall. Halfway down the corridor, Malcolm saw another figure on the floor. Ethan. The operations director had apparently tried to leave the control center alone after Malcolm sent him downstairs. A collapsing ceiling panel had struck his shoulder, pinning him beneath twisted ductwork only yards from safety. He looked up through the dust. There was no arrogance left in his eyes. Only fear. "Malcolm." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. This was the man who had challenged every order, delayed every precaution, and encouraged others to ignore the one decision that might have saved them precious minutes. The shelter door stood less than 30 yards away. Another violent impact shook the building. Emily stared at Malcolm, understanding the impossible choice unfolding before them. If they stopped, they might all be trapped. If they kept running, Ethan would almost certainly die. Malcolm never answered the apology. Instead, he stepped toward the fallen man, dropped to one knee beside the twisted debris, and wrapped both hands around the mangled section of ductwork. "We're all leaving this building," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. No exceptions. The twisted ductwork refused to move. Wind howled through the shattered corridor with such force that every breath felt borrowed. Dust swirled beneath the flashing emergency lights, reducing the world to fragments of shadow and amber light. Malcolm planted both feet against the cracked concrete. "Emily." She immediately understood. Together they gripped the mangled steel. On 3. The building shuddered again. 1. Another section of ceiling collapsed somewhere behind them. 2. The roar outside intensified until it drowned out every other sound. 3. With every ounce of strength they had, they lifted. The ductwork shifted. Just enough. Ethan cried out as he pulled his injured shoulder free and rolled onto the floor. "Move!" Malcolm shouted. There was no time for relief. Only movement. Emily slipped beneath Ethan's arm while Malcolm supported his other side. The three of them stumbled toward the reinforced shelter entrance as debris continued exploding through the corridor behind them. 20 yards. The pressure inside the hallway suddenly changed. Malcolm recognized it instantly. The tornado was passing directly across the facility. Down! He pushed both Ethan and Emily against the reinforced interior wall just as another bank of windows imploded. Glass swept across the hallway like frozen rain. Metal cabinets toppled. A fire extinguisher tore loose from its bracket and disappeared into the grey chaos. For several endless seconds, none of them could hear anything except the violent scream of the storm. Then, as suddenly as it had reached its peak, the pressure eased. Now! They forced themselves back onto their feet and covered the remaining distance. The shelter door stood open. Security officers rushed forward. Get inside! Hands reached out, pulling Ethan first, then Emily through the massive steel entrance. Malcolm remained outside for one final moment. He looked back into the ruined corridor. Attendants. One officer immediately checked the emergency tablet. Every employee badge had registered inside. Everyone's accounted for. Only then did Malcolm step through the doorway. The shelter door slammed shut. Heavy locking bolts engaged one after another with deep metallic thuds. Silence didn't return immediately. The storm continued pounding the reinforced structure overhead for what felt like an eternity. Inside the shelter, hundreds of employees sat shoulder to shoulder beneath emergency lighting. No one spoke. Children from the employee daycare clung to their teachers. Warehouse workers still wore dust-covered safety vests. Office managers stared at the concrete floor. Ethan sat against the wall with his injured shoulder wrapped in a temporary bandage. He watched Malcolm moving quietly through the shelter, checking on frightened employees one by one before stopping beside an elderly janitor whose hands were trembling. "Everyone all right here?" Malcolm asked gently. The janitor nodded, unable to speak. Only then did Malcolm finally sit down himself. His breathing was heavier now. His jacket was torn across one shoulder. Blood trickled from several cuts on his hands where twisted steel had scraped through the fabric. Emily noticed them first. "You were hurt." Malcolm glanced at his hands as though seeing them for the first time. "It can wait." Several people nearby lowered their heads. Minutes earlier they had questioned every decision he made. Now every person in the shelter understood the same truth. Had Malcolm waited for official confirmation? Had he argued longer? Had he allowed hesitation to replace action? Hundreds of people would still have been scattered across warehouses, loading docks, offices, and parking lots when the tornado struck. The realization settled over the room with crushing weight. Ethan slowly stood despite the pain in his shoulder. Every eye turned toward him. He looked across the crowded shelter until his gaze met Malcolm's. His voice was rough. "I spent the entire morning trying to prove you were wrong." He paused, swallowing hard. "You could have left me in that hallway." The shelter remained perfectly still. Malcolm looked at him for a long moment before answering. "If I had done that?" He glanced around at the hundreds of employees who had survived because they were sitting together in that room. "Then everything I asked this company to become would have meant nothing." No one applauded. No one needed to. In the quiet that followed, respect spread through the shelter more powerfully than fear ever had, and far above them, the fading roar of the tornado drifted eastward, leaving behind a company that would never again mistake calm leadership for hesitation. When the shelter doors finally unlocked, the world outside felt unfamiliar. The storm had moved east, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the distant wail of emergency vehicles and the slow drip of rainwater from twisted steel. The distribution campus that had begun the morning with perfect order now looked as though a giant hand had torn through its center. Several loading bays had collapsed. Freight trailers lay overturned across the yard. Shipping containers had been thrown against concrete barriers like discarded toys. Yet the shelters opened to something extraordinary. Every employee walked out alive. Firefighters and county emergency crews were already arriving when the first groups emerged. Their commanders stopped almost immediately after reviewing the company's emergency timeline. "You evacuated before the county warning was fully transmitted?" one official asked. Malcolm simply nodded. "We acted when waiting became the greater risk." Hours later, engineers confirmed what everyone had feared. The tornado had crossed directly through the logistics complex as an EF4, powerful enough to destroy large industrial buildings and overturn fully loaded trucks. Had evacuation begun even 5 minutes later, hundreds of employees would still have been scattered across warehouses and loading docks. The numbers spoke with a clarity no argument ever could. The following Monday, the company's headquarters filled once again. Not with fear. With reflection. Employees gathered in the same operations room where the first order had been questioned. The cracked windows had already been replaced. Temporary monitors covered the damaged walls. But no one sat in quite the same way. Ethan Walker entered with his shoulder still secured in a medical brace. The confidence that had once defined every step had been replaced by humility earned the hardest possible way. He walked to the front of the room before anyone else spoke. "I owe every person here an apology." The words came slowly. "I allowed certainty to become arrogance. I believed procedures mattered more than judgment. Worse, I let my assumptions about Malcolm's leadership blind me to the responsibility we all shared." He turned toward Malcolm. "I judged your decisions before I understood your experience." The room remained silent. Not uncomfortable. Respectful. Malcolm stood only after Ethan finished. He wasn't carrying prepared remarks. He didn't open a presentation. Instead, he looked around the room at the faces of warehouse workers, analysts, mechanics, accountants, janitors, supervisors, security officers, and managers who had all survived together. "I don't need everyone to agree with me," he said quietly. "I need everyone to care enough to protect one another before it's too late." He paused, letting the words settle. Leadership is not about winning arguments. His eyes moved across the room until they briefly met Ethan's. It is about accepting responsibility before certainty arrives. Emily Carter smiled softly. She realized the greatest lesson from that morning had never been about weather. It had been about character. About listening before judging. About courage that speaks calmly instead of loudly. Outside, reconstruction crews had already begun rebuilding the damaged loading docks. Twisted beams were lifted away. New foundations were marked. Life moved forward, not because the storm had been avoided, but because people had chosen to prepare before everyone else understood why. Months later, visitors entering Brooks Meridian Logistics would notice a simple bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance to the emergency shelter. It carried no photograph. No corporate logo. Only one sentence. The strongest leaders are not the ones who predict every storm. They are the ones who refuse to let anyone face it alone. Employees passed those words every day. Some remembered the wind. Others remembered the sirens. But all of them remembered one quiet black CEO who was doubted, challenged, and underestimated until the moment his courage transformed panic into survival and proved that true leadership is measured not by how loudly it commands, but by how faithfully it protects.